you don't have to smoke the hide to make it tan. What the smoking does is it makes it, like we talked about, the insects don't like it as much. It kind of fills in more of the spaces between the fibers to make it more water resistant. It helps preserve the hide, and then also if the hide gets wet, it makes it flexible afterwards easier. It helps keep the things that want to eat it away, because it's an irritant to like little small insects, and the bacteria, it helps shoo them away. Yeah. We have the hide all prepared, and we're getting ready to make the frame for the hide to be smoked over. And these are some birch poles that were just some standing dead wood that was dry, and we cut them down, and we're just brushing off any dirt and fungus or moss that was on them, and then wiping them off to make sure they don't have snow so that it doesn't put water or dirt onto the hide. We're going to be tying the tops of the poles together to make that like A-frame teepee shape for the hide to go over. To make the frame, we have about 6 poles here today, and you just need enough to where the hide is kept kind of away from the flames. So if you had a bigger hide, you might need more poles. If you had a smaller hide, you might need like 4 or 5. So to make the A-frame, they're actually like V's. It's just taking the 2 tips of the poles of the top and lashing them together to where you have an upside down V. And we'll do 3 sets of that, and then put 2 V's together, lash that together, and then add the next one and lash that together. And I'm using, this is like sisal, so it's a natural fiber. I could use some plastic rope, would probably be okay because it's at the way top, but I'm gonna start off with just using the, again, 100% natural fibers. One of the things you can do once you get it all tied together, these poles are gonna be adjustable because they're not anchored at the bottom or tethered at the bottom together. So you can collapse it like you do a tripod. We could put the poles down, thread the hide through it, and then open the poles from the inside out, the inside, so that we aren't having to use a ladder to get the hide over. We can work it all on our plane and then hoist it up. I'm wrapping the twine around kind of like a figure 8 or an infinity symbol, to where it's going around and then under, around this one, and then through the top. So it's kind of just overlocking it rather than tying knots. I'm kind of weaving it back and forth. So I'll go under the middle, over around this way, through the top, and then I am going to cut this and tie it off, and then I'm just going to tie the knot by coming through like this to cinch together all those pieces to make it a little bit tighter. The poles, it's okay if they have some bend to them. The main thing is you want them to be strong enough to where they aren't going to collapse with the weight of the hide, but you also want them thin enough to where they're not blocking the hide from getting smoke. We might actually tie all of the poles together here together at the top at once, and then set up the whole thing, because there's enough of us to where we can move things around that way. And that's a little bit different than I might do it by myself. So we've done 3 poles, and we just turned it over, so we're going to put another one on the side so it doesn't get all bunched up in one spot. The other thing is, if you tie this super tight, you can't move them, and we need these to expand and contract as we set it up. So it needs to be tight enough to where it's held firm and won't slide and be super sloppy, but loose enough to where it can articulate. We have 4 poles together right now. Because this is lashed together at the top, we can put the hide through it for right now, and it will be stable enough, and then we can look at the hide and figure out where another pole might need to go, and we can put a pole and have it just have the pressure of the hide kind of hold it in place. I'm just using this thicker plastic rope for kind of as a safety catch for why we're working with it. I'm just looping it around each pole so that as we kind of fit the hide in place and move it around, we don't inadvertently snap any of the twine and then have a pole come loose and hit anyone on the head before we get the hide on it. So the hide is going to go over it like a sheath, and they'll be hide up against the pole, and wherever the pole is, it's kind of acting as a resist, and it's keeping the smoke from getting into that spot. So we need, as we're smoking the hide, we're going to have to move the hide around the poles to create, so there's no blocking of the smoke. Even, that's the word. So we're going to move the hide around to get even coverage so it's not getting blocked by the pole. The cloth needs to be to the bottom of the poles on my side, so that's probably good. Since we're testing, I'm going to tie this to the top, so if we need to move it, we can move it. And that just keeps the hide from sliding down. Yep, like that. And then Monica, can you grab the bottom of the pole and bring it out towards you? Yep. We're just widening it out. We can see where the fire ring is right now, and it's a little too close to the hide. So we want to bring, and we have extra material that's touching the ground, so we want to raise the whole thing up a little bit. So we're just going to untie what I did with the twine and pull the whole hide and fabric up a little bit by another 6 inches maybe, and then tie it up a little bit higher. Traditionally, you would dig a hole to make it lower so you're not having to have your TP go as tall. So that's one of the things that helps you get the height without having to go as tall, because you're going down into the ground. But this was a first check to see how the distance from the ground was. 2 feet away from any type of open flame is kind of a rough estimate. When we lift it up a little bit more, it's going to make the poles at the bottom be able to open up wider. Go like that. This side in here is a little bit too close, so we're going to get a stick to hold some pressure there. We don't necessarily need a whole pole because up here is fine, so it's just to hold the bottom out a little bit more. And we're trying to get it to where the sides all look like they're far enough away. And like here's the distance is kind of like about 18 inches, 20 inches. So we're in that 2 foot range from the edge of the fire ring to the poles. So I'm gonna poke a hole here and then put the cord between it just to add a little bit of pressure rather than putting a stick on the inside. We're just gonna lash it out from the outside. I cut 2 holes, so it's like basically doing it one giant stitch. I'm tying the cord through each side. So the main thing is just that tying this here brought this section further away from the fire, and this drape here is okay. It's just getting this kind of further away. This part here was draping a little bit too close to the fire, so rather than doing what we did on the other side, which was a pole on the outside, we put a stick on the inside, and it's right at the base of where the hide starts, so it's touching canvas. So once again, it's not creating any like resist by having the wood touch the hide. So that's far enough away from the fire, and if there's any wind and it like starts to flap, it's not going to be able to flap right there. So that's why we want that tension. So we have the hide all positioned the way that we want, and we're going to pull the fire ring out and start a fire so that it can flame up when we get it going. And then because it's on a metal frame, we'll be able to just kind of scoot it under the hide where we want it to be. So what we are using for the fire starters, this is just dry spruce branches that are usually low under a big tree, and just break them off. This is wood that has more integrity to it than the decayed punky wood. This is going to have the most flame going, so we started it out here. But it's going to give us coals and more heat to keep the punky wood burning. The punk wood doesn't just like create flames, which is part of the reason why you want it. So you need a better like heat source to keep the fire smoldering. So we're going to let this catch on fire, and you can see the big flames now, which is why we didn't have it under the hide at first. So this wood here has grain still in it, and it's harder, and it's going to burn hot, and it's going to create the flames, which is what we're trying to do right now to get that kind of charcoal or that coal going. As we move to the middle, we get more brown rot happening, and this wood is really soft. I can like squish it with my fingers. I can almost crumble it with my hand, and we're going to use the punky rotten wood to create smoke. So after you've harvested it, you want to get it dry. So what we did with this wood is I brought it into a garage space that had in-floor heat and laid it out on the floor heat. Ideally what you would do is gather it and then just have it in a dry place and let it naturally just be drying out. Helen and I were talking about the fire, and it's going now, and there is flame up right here, but there's a nice like bed of like ember going that's a nice cherry red. So when we put the punk on top of this, the flames will kind of die down, but the fire will keep on burning underneath. So it's ready, we can slide it back under the hide. So we have our punky wood in this box here ready to go. So we've kind of, in some ways, smothered the flame with the punky rotten wood, and it's creating a lot of smoke, and it's made the flames kind of shoot down. There's a smell change in the smoke now, and it looks a different color too. We want to be checking on it a lot to make sure if it doesn't flame up and catch anything on fire. The fire was flaring up too much, so we just took out some of that drier wood and put on some more of the crumbly punky wood. And we're kind of able to start to see a little bit of color change on the inside, and that's a good sign, and we should see a color change, but it takes a while for it to permeate through. And one of the things you can do is you can feel the inside of the canvas and the hide to make sure it's not getting too hot. Is one of the ways, because you can't really see inside if anything was burning, but you can feel it, and you can also feel the poles, and it's not really hot. So we'd stretched the bottom a little bit wider than we had fabric to close up, so we just made a little extending tent flap with some extra towels and muslin fabric to keep the smoke funneling through. So when you're getting ready to smoke, it's a good idea to have like clothespins and clips and extra fabric and plywood, things that you can cover openings up with real fast. So the question is, how do you know like what's happening inside while you're smoking? And one of it is the fabric's an indicator. And so we know that it's working because the fabric is changing color, and you can see near the top where there's fabric that's overlapping the hide, and that's still very white. And then there's fabric above it, and that fabric is starting to turn brown. So one of the questions is, you have all this fabric down here and the lower parts of the hide, is it getting smoked? And you can see that the smoke is actually escaping through this seam right here. So you know that the hide is getting smoked lower down. I'm just using my hand to feel how hot the hide and the fabric is on the outside to make sure that there's not hot spots. And then you want to keep checking on the inside to make sure there's nothing flaring up and getting charred. If it feels like, ooh, that's like hot, like if you touch a rivet on Carhartts when it comes out of the dryer, or a zipper, and it's that you kind of want to pull your hand away, that's too hot. But if you can hold it and it's warm, it should feel warm. If you kind of keep the oxygen situation lower on the inside too, that helps create more smoke and less flame. And then the other thing that's nice about using the rotten wood is there is less like carbon bonds in the wood, and so that's creating less heat. So it may look like it's burning and flaming up taller. That flame is higher, but it's not as hot as if you had wood that wasn't rotten. So you're creating a lower temperature flame and more smoke. So we're just kind of testing and feeling it. We're gonna let the fire kind of die down a little bit to make sure it doesn't get too hot, and just watch it to make sure we don't lose too much heat energy so we don't have to build the fire again, but we're not gonna add anything more for a little bit. So we wanted to check and make sure, because it was looking a little bit too black on the outside in some ways, and the rings of the holes are looking a little sooty, so we wanted to check the inside and make sure it wasn't getting too hot, so we just lifted it up to be able to look at it, and it's doing okay. We're gonna add a little bit more punk, and you can see this line right here, if it's light, that's where that pole is. And you can really see the color change on the fabric. We were smoking a little bit too hot, a little bit too smoke. And that's why it takes time. You can't just be like, and then be done, because it needs to penetrate through. So we're just shifting the poles rather than moving the whole hide. And that was one of the reasons to make the poles at the top be able to articulate. So I'm just moving it over a little bit to where now it's resting on a different part of the hide. So I had my hand on the pole and a hand on the hide, and I was moving the pole, and then before I let go of the hide and the pole, I let go of the pole slowly to make sure that it wasn't going to topple over, and kind of moved the hide, shook the hide a little bit to make sure that the poles were stable so it didn't fall over. And I did one at a time. And I don't know if you can see the fire at all, but you can see how it's not really flaming at all, it's just smoldering. And there's enough heat in there to let it smolder, and the flames are very minimal if there's any flame up. The longest I would wait would be 15 minutes to check on it, because there is a lot that could change. If you get a chunk of wood that maybe looked really rotten on the outside but actually had a nice solid core, that's gonna burn hotter. Or if it gets too cold, then you're gonna have a hard time getting it to smolder again. You have to like kind of build the fire back up. So we've moved the poles, each one over kind of about a foot, so that it's in a completely different spot. And then looked at the hide to see how it was going and make sure there wasn't any burn spots on the inside. And then put on some bigger pieces of punk to really get a lot of smoke going again. This is just ensuring like the whole entire thing is getting heavy smoke right now. And then it need to have, it takes time to permeate through the skin. So we let it smoke really heavily for a while, and then let it kind of die down and let it just kind of absorb it. And then we move the poles, and then we're gonna smoke it really heavily again, kind of let it die down. And then we'll move the poles again and keep doing it that way. And you're continually doing the heavy light until you get the color that you want. And the fire is pretty flamey right now. It's not hot flames, it's just not smoking as much. So I'm using the small stuff. It's not gonna produce very much heat, just to kind of give it a little bit more smoke while that flame is going. It is kind of a tricky thing to keep it smoking really heavily without developing heat. So what you're doing is you're kind of consuming up those embers that were there before as it dies down, and then you're giving it more fuel, and that kind of flares up a little bit, and then that kind of cools off as far as the flame stops being produced, and then now you have a nice pile of embers again, and you can load more on. These parts here are where the hide is thinner, and so the smoke is moving through them faster than the thicker parts. Someone may have scraped too thinly or kept the wire wheel in one spot too much, and they're getting more smoke faster than the areas around it, and it really should be more of an even skin, but it's just part of that learning experience for everybody. It's something that's like soot or ash that you could like vacuum off later or brush out later a little bit.
It's not too much concern.
Yeah, we're not too worried about it. It's not the most ideal thing per se, but it's not like ruining the hide. So if you wanted to see how far in the smoke has penetrated, you could take a sample cut. What I'm just gonna do is to show, because there's a hole right here. The smoke hasn't really permeated very deeply, and so we still have a few more hours to go. It seemed like it was a little bit too hot, so I took a couple pieces out and spread out the fire a little bit so that it would cool off. And we're letting it kind of, some of the heat escape when it's open too. It's not too black. Like that was one of the things we were looking for. So if you're planning to smoke a hide and you want to give yourself at least like 5 to 8 hours of time for smoking with actual smoke time, because you need that kind of burst of smoke and then letting it cool down, burst of smoke, letting it cool down, and it takes time for the smoke to permeate the hide. If you need to stop, you just want to keep your hide dry, and you can pick up where you left off like the next day. So this is all in a stable place. If you decided later like, I want a little bit more smoke, you could make the frame again and you could smoke it some more. So it's something it's different than when the hide's like wet and you have to keep it cold or dry or frozen. The main thing with it now is just keep it dry. So once you've taken it off the frame, let's say bring it inside, you can roll it up, you could fold it up. I like to maybe lay it out flat and let it rest a little bit, because there is it's been warmed and it's loose, and if you put like folds in it and leave it dry fold, then it might get some slight crease lines in it because it's that first initial dry. So just letting it kind of relax over something smooth and then roll it up later or fold it up later. So I've been smoking the hide for about 4 hours, and you can see the color change. It's starting to get more of a goldener brown. We talked a little bit with Helen about how the trees in Kenai we're pretty close to the ocean, and the trees have a different smell and they have a different color, and we're going to not necessarily get that same really goldeny brown color that you can get or you see coming out of the interior of Alaska or in the interior in Canada, because our trees just they have more salt water in them. But you still do get color to them, and you can see that there is quite a bit of color change that's happened so far. And we're gonna probably smoke the rest of the wood that we brought, which is maybe another 2-3 gallons worth of wood, volume, and then call it good, because it has a good color change, and we're on the right track, and that'll be enough. It was winter, which means we couldn't dig a hole in the ground, and it wasn't quite the ideal situation to do it. We did it, and you can do it. It's just, it's easier when it's not winter to smoke the hide. We got the fire a little bit too warm, possibly, and the hide was a little bit too close to the fire, and we could have had maybe not it sealed all the way to the ground and had a little bit more airflow into the hide. It was all those things that, and we were talking about that with Helen while we were doing it. She's like, this will work. It's just, it's not the ideal thing. We were just talking with Charlie about the color of the hide. We talked with Jeanie about it, and also Helen. And what we noticed when we had taken down the teepee in December is that the canvas at the top of the teepee was sticky, and it was like creosote had built up on it, and that's part of what this soot creosote-y black is. There wasn't enough airflow happening to where it was allowing the creosote to escape and exit instead of sticking to the hide. So you can see like these parts here are very much, they're darker, and that's where the air was escaping and it was depositing more creosote. And Helen had commented how they do like 4 hides, to where you have a much bigger area for the smoke to escape from rather than such a small area. And we were talking with Charlie as well, and he's noting that we haven't done a lot of these things in quite a few years and decades, and that it's part of the effects of the colonization, and that we're reawakening these things and just experimenting and tinkering with it, which is exactly what people have been doing for hundreds of years. So this is a very normal thing to be doing, and it's allowing us to teach and relearn and talk about these things. Throughout this process, we've been talking with elders. We've been talking with Charlie Hubbard and Jeanie Maxim and Helen Dick, and one of the things that they've been emphasizing is that the time of year that you do these steps is important, and that you can't rush them. You need to pay attention to what the hide wants to do and what the conditions are. So we've been talking a lot about the traditional way that they did them, that their grandparents, their moms did them, and part of that step is you want to get the moose hides in the springtime when they're thinner, and then in the fall is when you tan your moose, or after fishing season is when you start tanning your hides, and then you get kind of a stack of hides ready to go. And maybe if you had time and it was very clear weather, you might tan them in the fall or smoke them in the fall. But if the fall is usually rainy, so that doesn't make the most sense for tanning or for smoking your hides. So in the wintertime, when it's 30 below outside, isn't really the ideal situation for smoking the hides. So smoking the hides would happen more so in the spring when the weather's good and you know that it's not going to be rainy. And you have your stack of hides that you've softened and tanned in the fall. You have them freeze all winter, or like what Helen was talking about, where you work on them, you bring them inside, and Jeanie was talking about you have to do the hides inside if it's winter and they're frozen. You work on them a little bit and then put them back outside and they freeze. We've been mimicking that with the freezer, because we have been working on this as we have time with our work schedules and teaching schedules and all those kinds of things that we deal with today. So we've been trying to replicate some of those seasonal weather systems artificially with like the freezer, for example. We've talked about 3 different stages of smoking. We've talked about smoking a raw hide. We've talked about taking a hide that has been softened, but there's still hard spots, like the one that we're working with Sandra on. And that one we could smoke and then put back into brain solution and then soften it till it's dry and all soft. And then that would lead to the final smoking, which is when the hide is completely as soft as you're gonna get it, it's ready to sew, and you're doing a finishing smoke to give the color that you want. And it's more so for color and allowing it to, if it gets wet again, be easier to soften so it doesn't become as stiff. That's what that final finishing smoke does. And then the other thing that's very important is that there's not a recipe for this. It's when it's ready, it's ready. So you look at it and the color, you're going for color. So if the color is good, you stop. If the color needs a little bit more smoke, you keep smoking it a little bit longer. And there's less finickiness to it than there might be in making like a souffle, where you have to follow the steps exactly. Certain temperature, certain amount of time, don't touch it or it'll fall in the wrong time. The hide isn't quite like that. You need to just give it what it needs, and that could mean some days it might need 2 hours and other days it might need an hour. And sometimes you have the wood that produces a lot of smoke, and then sometimes it may be good wood that looks right, it feels right, but it doesn't smoke as much, so you need a little bit more of it, and that's okay.